Most people think they already know Pakistan's story in the Middle East. They think it goes something like this. Pakistan is a poor, unstable, Muslim majority country that relies on Gulf money to survive. Saudi Arabia and the UAE throw billions in aid and remittances at Islamabad. And in return, Pakistan nods obediently at whatever Riyadh wants. Dependent, transactional, reactive, a client state wearing the clothes of an independent nation. That story is not just incomplete. It is fundamentally wrong. And the gap between that conventional picture and what Pakistan is actually doing in the Middle East right now is one of the most strategically interesting stories unfolding anywhere in the world. Almost nobody in the Western press is covering it seriously. I want to change that today. Because when you actually look at the pattern of Pakistani behavior across the Middle East over the past decade, when you look at what Islamabad has done, what it has refused to do, who it has aligned with, and who it has deliberately kept at arm's length, and how it has navigated the most violent and fractured region on earth without being consumed by it, what you find is not a client state. What you find is a country pursuing a sophisticated, sometimes audacious, and deeply underestimated strategic vision. And that vision could reshape the balance of power in South Asia and the broader Islamic world in ways that most analysts have not yet reckoned with. So let's reckon with it now. To understand Pakistan's current Middle East strategy, you have to begin with a foundational question that Pakistani strategists have been wrestling with since the country's creation in 1947. What is Pakistan's role in the Muslim world? This is not merely a rhetorical or religious question. It has always been a question of hard power and strategic positioning. Pakistan was born as the world's largest Muslim majority state, a distinction it held until Bangladesh's independence in 1971. And from the very beginning, its leaders understood that its Muslim identity was not just a domestic political fact, but a potential source of regional and international influence. The early Pakistani state cultivated ties with the Arab world for reasons that were partly ideological and partly deeply practical. Arab states provided diplomatic support, Gulf money funded development, and critically, the military. Pakistani workers remitting wages from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE became a structural pillar of the domestic economy. And Pakistani military officers and soldiers served quietly but extensively in the security establishments of multiple Gulf states, training their forces, commanding their units, providing the kind of professional military expertise that oil-rich but manpower-constrained monarchies could not easily generate internally. This created what looked, from the outside, like a relationship of dependency. And in important ways, it was. Pakistan needed the Gulf, and the Gulf knew it. But here's a critical thing that the dependency narrative misses. Pakistan's military capability, its nuclear weapons, its large and battle-hardened army, and its geographic position between the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, and China gave it a form of strategic leverage that no amount of financial dependence could fully extinguish. Pakistan was never merely a supplicant. It was always also a potential security provider. And in the volatile Middle East, serious security capacity is one of the most valuable commodities in existence. The question was always how skillfully Pakistan could manage that leverage. And the answer to that question has varied dramatically across different Pakistani governments and different regional moments. The moment that crystallized Pakistan's strategic autonomy for a global audience, and that remains, I think, one of the most important and underanalyzed decisions in Pakistani foreign policy history, came in 2015. In March of that year, Saudi Arabia launched its military intervention in Yemen, targeting the Houthi movement that had taken control of much of the country, and which Riyadh characterized as an Iranian proxy force threatening to destabilize the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia immediately turned to Pakistan, expecting Al-Asmab to contribute troops and military assets to the coalition. The Saudis had reason to expect this. They had billions invested in Pakistan. They had been major donors to Pakistani political and religious institutions for decades. The relationship, from Riyadh's perspective, had been built on an implicit understanding. When the kingdom called, Pakistan would answer. Pakistan's parliament voted to stay out of the Yemen war. Let that sink in for a moment. Pakistan, dependent on Saudi remittances, recipient of Saudi aid, home to significant Saudi-funded religious institutions, told the Saudi king no through a democratic vote. And it held that position despite enormous Saudi pressure, including a visit from Saudi Crown Prince that made the urgency of Riyadh's expectations unmistakably clear. Why? The official Pakistani justifications focused on the imperative of remaining neutral in intra-Muslim conflicts and on concerns about sectarian blowback domestically. Pakistan has a significant Shia Muslim minority, somewhere between 15 and 20% of the population, and Pakistani generals were acutely aware that deploying Pakistani troops against Houthi forces, which many Pakistani Shia saw as defending themselves against Saudi aggression, could ignite sectarian violence at home. These were real concerns, but they were not the whole story. The deeper strategic logic was this. Pakistan had watched what happened to states that became instrumentalized by Middle Eastern powers in regional proxy conflicts. It had watched the Lebanese state hollowed out by the intersection of Iranian, Saudi, Syrian, and Israeli interference. It had watched Iraq destroyed not just by American invasion, but by the sectarian proxy war that followed. It had watched Libya and Syria consumed by interventions that served the interests of outside powers while devastating the countries themselves. Pakistani military planners, who have always been the true architects of Pakistani foreign policy, made a cold calculation. The Yemen war was a Saudi project in pursuit of Saudi interests. It would be costly, prolonged, and politically toxic domestically. The benefits to Pakistan were marginal. The risks were severe, and refusing, even at the cost of short-term friction with Riyadh, would demonstrate something important, that Pakistan was not a Saudi instrument, that it had its own strategic calculus, and that its cooperation had to be earned on terms that Pakistan itself defined. That is not the behavior of a client state. That is the behavior of a state pursuing an independent foreign policy. Now let's talk about what Pakistan has been building in the Middle East in the decades since the Yemen decision, because this is where the story gets genuinely surprising. The first element is Pakistan's deliberate cultivation of a multi-vector relationship structure across the Gulf, one designed specifically to avoid overdependence on any single patron. For decades, Pakistan's Gulf relationships were heavily weighted towards Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were the dominant partner, religiously, financially, and politically. But over the past 10 to 15 years, Pakistan has systematically deepened its relationship with the UAE, with Qatar, and most recently with Turkey, creating a more diversified network of Middle Eastern partnerships that gives Islamabad significantly more room to maneuver. The UAE relationship has become particularly important and is worth examining closely. The Emirates and Pakistan have developed an extraordinarily deep economic and security relationship that goes well beyond the traditional remittance and aid model. The UAE is now one of Pakistan's largest foreign investors. Pakistani diaspora in the UAE number in the millions and are deeply integrated into the Emirates economy. Emirati sovereign wealth funds have made substantial investments in Pakistani infrastructure and energy projects. And at the security level, the two countries have developed intelligence sharing and counterterrorism cooperation arrangements that reflect genuine mutual interest rather than patron-client dynamics. What makes this relationship particularly interesting is that the UAE and Saudi Arabia, while formally allied, have divergent interests and strategic visions in important respects. Abu Dhabi has consistently pursued a more pragmatic, transactional foreign policy than Riyadh, more willing to engage with Iran when interests align, more focused on commercial relationships than on ideological solidarity, more skeptical of the Islamist political movements that Saudi Arabia has at various points supported. By developing deep ties with both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, Pakistan has positioned itself to navigate the nuances of intra-Gulf politics in ways that a purely Saudi-dependent Pakistan never could. The Qatar relationship adds another dimension. Qatar has been the target of a Saudi-UAE-led blockade and pressure campaign. a rupture in Gulf solidarity that put Pakistan in the uncomfortable position of having to navigate between its major Gulf partners. Pakistan handled this with considerable dexterity, maintaining functional relationships with all sides, refusing to join the anti-Qatar coalition, and positioning itself as a potential mediator, a role that reflected and reinforced its image as a state with genuine strategic independence in the Gulf context. The second element of Pakistan's emerging Middle East strategy, and this is the one that I think has the most profound long-term implications, is its management of the Saudi-Iran dynamic. Pakistan shares a long border with Iran. It has a substantial Shia minority population. It has historical and cultural ties with the Persian world that predate the creation of the Pakistani state. And it has, from the very beginning of the Islamic Republic, been caught in the impossible position of a state that desperately needs Saudi money but cannot afford to be seen as an anti-Iranian instrument. The conventional wisdom has been that Pakistan has consistently subordinated its Iran relationship to its Saudi relationship, that Riyadh's financial leverage has kept Islamabad aligned with the Saudi strategic vision, including the framing of regional politics as a Sunni-Shia Arab-Persian civilizational contest. The reality is considerably more complex. Pakistan has consistently resisted being drawn into the full logic of the Saudi-Iran Cold War. It has maintained an Iranian diplomatic relationship even when the pressure to downgrade it has been enormous. It has pursued the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline project, the so-called Peace Pipeline. Despite American sanctions pressure and Saudi displeasure, even if the project has moved at a glacial pace largely because of those external pressures, it has avoided the most inflammatory anti-Iranian rhetoric that has characterized Saudi public diplomacy. And it has repeatedly signaled at both the official and back-channel level that it sees a stable relationship with Iran as a strategic necessity rather than a liability. Why does this matter? Because Pakistan geography makes Iran inescapable. The two countries share nearly 900 kilometers of border. Iran is Pakistan's gateway to energy imports and to Central Asian markets. Iranian stability or instability directly affects Pakistan's security, particularly in Balochistan, where cross-border ethnic and insurgent dynamics have a direct connection to Pakistani territorial integrity. A Pakistan that fully aligned with the Saudi anti-Iran axis would gain short-term financial rewards at the cost of long-term border security and regional stability. Pakistani military planners understand this. They have consistently refused to make that trade. What Pakistan has done instead is something quite difficult. It has tried to maintain productive relationships with both Riyadh and Tehran simultaneously, positioning itself as one of the very few states in the world capable of serving as a bridge between these two implacable rivals. That bridge-building role has not been seamless or cost-free. Pakistan has been criticized by both sides for insufficient commitment. There have been serious tensions along the Iran-Pakistan border, including Iranian strikes on Pakistani territory in early 2024 that produced a serious, if brief, crisis. But the fundamental strategic posture has survived those tensions. And that posture, Pakistan as a potential mediator between the Gulf Arab states and Iran, gives Islamabad a form of strategic value that a purely Saudi-aligned Pakistan could never claim. The third element is Pakistan's relationship with Turkey, which has emerged as a genuinely significant new vector in Pakistan's Middle East and Islamic world strategy. The Erdogan-era Turkey-Pakistan relationship has developed a depth and warmth that is, I think, quite remarkable. The two countries have cultivated strong military-to-military ties, including cooperation in defense production and joint military exercises. Turkey has supported Pakistan's position on Kashmir in international forums in ways that no Arab state has consistently done. The two leaders have publicly expressed a sense of shared civilizational mission and mutual solidarity that goes beyond normal diplomatic language. And the joint Turkish-Pakistan-Malaysian axis that briefly emerged around 2019, when Erdogan, Imran Khan, and Mahathir Mohamad discussed creating an alternative to Saudi-controlled Islamic media, signaled an ambition to reshape the leadership structures of the broader Muslim world. That trilateral initiative did not survive the intense Saudi pressure that was applied to derail it. Pakistan backed away significantly after Riyadh threatened economic retaliation. but the episode revealed something important. There is a Pakistani strategic aspiration to play a role in the Muslim world that is not merely derivative of Saudi patronage. There is an appetite in Islamabad for a seat at the table of Muslim world leadership, not as Saudi Arabia's subcontract, but as an independent voice representing a different vision of Muslim political identity. Turkey's own assertive foreign policy vision, and Ankara's willingness to directly challenge Saudi and Emirati interests in Libya, Syria, and the broader Eastern Mediterranean has made it a complicated partner for Pakistan. Getting too close to Ankara risks friction with Riyadh. But the relationship persists because it serves real Pakistani interests in defense, technology, and political solidarity on Kashmir, and in the broader project of building an Islamic world coalition that is not simply an extension of Gulf Arab power. Now, I need to address the elephant in the room. The element of Pakistani Middle East strategy that complicates everything I've said so far and that honest analysis cannot avoid: the economic crisis. Pakistan's finances are, as of the mid-2020s, in a genuinely precarious state. The country has gone to the IMF repeatedly for bailout programs. Its foreign exchange reserves have at various points been dangerously low. Its debt burden is severe. And this economic vulnerability has real consequences for strategic autonomy. When you are dependent on Gulf remittances for a significant portion of your foreign exchange earnings, when millions of your citizens work in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, and their ability to continue working there is partly contingent on the political relationship between Islamabad and those capitals, your strategic independence is real but constrained. You can say no to the Yemen war when the costs of saying yes are sufficiently high and obvious. You are more constrained when the ask is more ambiguous and the financial pressure is more diffuse. This is the central tension in Pakistani Middle East strategy. And I want to be honest about it, rather than paper over it with a narrative of Pakistani strategic genius that the economic realities complicate. Pakistan's ability to sustain genuine strategic autonomy in the Middle East is partly contingent on reducing that economic vulnerability. And that reduction depends on domestic economic reform, on successful development of the China-Pakistan economic corridor's potential, and on building export capacity that reduces the structural dependence on remittances. The CPEC factor is critical here. China's economic investment in Pakistan through the CPEC framework gives Islamabad an alternative source of capital and infrastructure development that reduces incrementally its dependence on Gulf largesse. It does not eliminate that dependence, not by any means, but it changes the geometry of dependence. And that changed geometry gives Pakistani strategists somewhat more room to maneuver than they would have had in a world where the Gulf was the only available patron. Let me now turn to the dimension of Pakistan's Middle East strategy that I think will ultimately prove most consequential: the nuclear dimension. Pakistan is the world's only Muslim-majority nuclear power. That fact has always cast a long shadow over its relationship with the Middle East and over the question of what Pakistan's role in Muslim world security might ultimately become. The question of whether Pakistan would ever share nuclear technology with the Middle Eastern state, and particularly with Saudi Arabia, which has reportedly funded portions of Pakistan's nuclear program historically, is one of the most sensitive and consequential questions in global non-proliferation policy. Pakistani officials consistently deny any such intention, and I see no reason to believe that a formal transfer is imminent or planned. But the existence of Pakistani nuclear capability shapes the strategic calculus of every actor in the Middle East in ways that go beyond any specific transfer scenario. For Saudi Arabia, the knowledge that Pakistan has nuclear weapons and maintains a relationship with Riyadh is a form of implicit deterrence against Iranian nuclear ambitions, a backstop that reduces somewhat the Saudi incentive to develop its own nuclear program. For Iran, the Pakistani nuclear arsenal is a constant reminder that the nuclear balance in the broader region is not bilateral, that any Iranian move toward weaponization would occur in an environment where a Muslim-majority neighbor with a long history of strategic rivalry already possesses the deterrent Iran is seeking. For Pakistan, the nuclear capability is the ultimate foundation of the strategic autonomy I have been describing throughout this analysis, You cannot fully subordinate a nuclear-armed state. You can pressure it, incentivize it, constrain it, but you cannot ultimately control it in the way that you can control a conventionally armed dependent. Pakistani military planners have understood this since the moment they tested their weapons in 1998. The nuclear capability is the bedrock on which the rest of the strategic edifice rests. So what does all this add up to? What is the strategic vision that Pakistan is actually pursuing in the Middle East beneath the surface of financial dependency and rhetorical Islamic solidarity? I would characterize it this way. Pakistan is pursuing a strategy of structured multi-alignment, maintaining multiple significant relationships with competing regional powers simultaneously, avoiding overcommitment to any single patron or axis, and positioning itself as an indispensable bridge builder and security provider whose cooperation cannot be taken for granted but must be actively cultivated and compensated. This strategy is not uniquely Pakistani. It shares important features with the strategic postures of countries like Turkey, Indonesia, and the UAE itself. States that have learned to navigate a world of competing great powers and regional blocs by maximizing their options rather than locking themselves into exclusive alliances. It is in important respects a 21st century strategy for a multipolar world. What makes the Pakistani version of this strategy distinctive, and what gives it its particular weight and consequence, is the combination of factors that Pakistan brings to the table. A larger nuclear-armed military with genuine conventional and unconventional capability. A geographic position that makes it relevant to the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, and China. Simultaneously, a Muslim majority population of over 230 million that gives it demographic weight in the Islamic world and a diaspora presence in the Gulf states that creates a deep, structurally embedded form of economic and social connectivity that no amount of political friction can quickly dissolve. That combination is genuinely formidable. It is why, despite all of its economic difficulties and domestic instabilities, Pakistan continues to be taken seriously by every major power in the region and beyond. And that brings me to what I want to leave you with today. The broader implication of Pakistan's Middle East strategy for how we should think about the evolving international order. We live in a moment when the familiar categories of international relations, patron and client, great power and dependent state, hegemon and peripheral player, are being scrambled by a multipolar transition that gives middle powers more room to maneuver than they have had in generations. The era of unipolar American dominance, in which Washington could effectively determine the alignment choices of states like Pakistan through a combination of financial incentives, security guarantees, and coercive pressure, is over. In its place, we are seeing the emergence of what I would call strategic promiscuity, a world in which states pursue relationships with multiple competing powers, extracting maximum value from each relationship while avoiding the costs of exclusive alignment. This is not simply opportunism, though it can look like opportunism from the outside. It is, in many cases, a sophisticated and rational response to a genuinely multipolar world. A world in which no single power can offer all of the security, economic, and diplomatic goods that states need, and in which the costs of picking the wrong side in a great power competition can be catastrophic. Pakistan's Middle East strategy, understood correctly, is an early and sophisticated example of this kind of strategic navigation. It is a preview of how middle powers, states with enough capability to have options, but not enough power to dominate, will behave in the multipolar world that is now emerging. And if that is right, then understanding Pakistan's approach to the Middle East is not merely a matter of understanding one country's foreign policy. It is a window into the emerging logic of the international order, a logic that will shape the security and prosperity of billions of people across the planet in the decades ahead. That is why this story matters. That is why Pakistan's Middle East strategy could surprise you. Not because Pakistan is secretly a great power, but because a country that most of the world has written off as a perpetual basket case, too poor, too unstable, too dependent to have a real foreign policy of its own, has been quietly building something more sophisticated and more consequential than almost anyone has noticed. Pay attention to Islamabad. It will reward your attention.